True racial prejudice, the corrosion of which, for well nigh a century, has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society. So after having synthesized this critical whiteness research, right, we can better understand and have appreciate a better understanding of what does it mean that the corrosion of racial prejudice has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, which is why it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. And we can better understand why he urges us to focus our attention on ourselves, to address our personal deficiencies and weaknesses. And so from a white supremacist and whiteness perspective, we can get a glance of what that could be, right? How do we focus on ourselves? Why is it important to start thinking about our own personal deficiencies and weaknesses that have been inherited, that we have inherited as a nation? And so what are some of these spiritual prerequisites that the Guardian asks us to cultivate patiently and prayerfully for the indispensable work of the faith? And so here are two of them, and I'm not going to talk about a chaste and holy life, but one is a rectitude of conduct. So this abiding sense of undeviating justice. Two spiritual prerequisites that we need. And two is this idea of freedom from racial prejudice, right? And so I definitely think that this rectitude of conduct and freedom from racial prejudice go hand in hand when we think about justice. And Shoghi Effendi tells us, be fair to yourselves and to others, that the evidences of justice may be revealed through your deeds among our faithful servants. Equity is the most fundamental among human virtues. The evaluation of all things must needs depend on it. And so as we think back on historically whiteness and a white supremacist framework, and thinking about what does it mean to be a race traitor or not to act white, we can think about what the Guardian is asking us to do, that the evidences of justice may be revealed through your deeds among our faithful servants. What would those deeds look like, right? And so when we think about a rectitude of conduct, we think about the words of the Guardian, the terms that he uses. He uses equity. He uses justice. He uses truthfulness. He uses honesty, right, to describe this idea of rectitude of conduct. And so my challenge to you is to start asking ourselves and yourselves, are we being truthful to ourselves concerning the ways we own up or not to our false sense of superiority? What would a rectitude of conduct look like in the face of the most challenging issue? What would my rectitude of conduct look like in the face of the most challenging issue? How would I choose to act? And so how are we addressing our complicity, right, when we feign ignorance of the ways whiteness affects people of color through racism in our Baha'i and broader communities? How do we, at an individual level, when a person of color, specifically someone in the Baha'i community, comes to us and talks to us about how they're feeling oppressed or shut down or silenced or in some other way really hurt by the way the community is treating them, how do we react? How do we choose to react? Do we feign ignorance because we've been taught to project this semblance of everything is fine, unity and diversity? How do we do that? How do we, and is this really what Shoghi Effendi is asking us to do, right? We all have to really contemplate and reflect on these really important questions and think about, how is this affecting us? How is it affecting people of color? Am I feigning ignorance? Are the things that I've been taught culturally in the Baha'i spaces to perpetuate, is that feigning ignorance, right? Is it? And think about that. And so my challenge for you today, it is through your deeds that ye can distinguish yourselves from others. And so how are we going to distinguish ourselves from others? Through our deeds, right? Or how are you going to distinguish yourselves from others through your deeds as it regards the most challenging issue? And so I challenge everyone to think about this idea of breaking the racial contract and not acting white. What does that look like in our day-to-day life? How do we choose on a day-to-day basis not to act white, not to perpetuate the storylines or ignore or suppress the racial subordination that is happening around us? How do we begin to listen to the stories and experiences of people of color and elevate their voices so that we can start to understand this most challenging issue, how it has affected us historically, generationally, what we've perpetuated, and also how does it affect people of color? And I wanted to share this and address this small point. Well, actually, it's a really big point. So Shoghi Effendi says, the canopy of existence resteth upon the pole of justice and not of forgiveness. And the life of mankind dependeth on justice and not on forgiveness. So for those who had the opportunity to watch the presentation on justice at the ABS conference, it was really amazing. I highly recommend everyone. If you haven't seen it yet, the recording is online. And she really digs into this idea of justice. However, here, I just want to talk about justice versus forgiveness. Oftentimes in race work or in race, whenever in spaces where we're calling out racism, we're calling out white supremacy, we're calling out whiteness, oftentimes the first reaction is, but he had good intentions, right? He had good intentions. Please don't call him a racist. He had good intentions. And so my point to bring up this excerpt from Shoghi Effendi is that really, honestly, intentions are not relevant here. Because when we think about, for me, when I interpret this, when we think about resteth upon the pole of justice and not on forgiveness, oftentimes when people bring up intent, what I think they're telling me is that you need to forgive, right? You need to forgive and forget. You need to move on. It's not their fault. However, that is fine at an individual level, right? When we think about forgiveness, I can still forgive at the individual level. I can choose to forgive. However, when we think about this quotation and racism in terms of impact, right? So intent versus impact. When we think about justice and how important it is that the canopy of existence resteth upon the pole of justice and not of forgiveness, and we think about the impact instead of the intent, regardless of intent, if my actions had a violent and deadly impact, and even just maybe a small racist impact, right? A microaggression onto a person of color, then I need to think about how justice can be served. Because for me, at the end of the day, the life of mankind dependeth on justice and not on forgiveness. And so at the individual level, we can think about how we want to forgive, but on a societal level and structurally, institutionally, through whether it's Baha'i governance or in different institutions, we need to think about the difference between friends bringing up this idea of good intentions when they're called out for doing something or maybe saying something racist that psychologically or physically impacts people of color, and the harm that people of color experience at the hands of those who embody whiteness, right? That threatens the very life of mankind. And so Shoghi Effendi is very clear that the life of mankind depends on justice and not on forgiveness. And so when we think about policing, we are often quick to bring up intent or implicit bias of cops. But if we know that the very life of mankind depends on justice and not on forgiveness, then we may perceive the violent and deadly crimes committed by cops through the eyes of justice and not forgiveness, especially as it regards this most challenging issue. And so once again, I want to reiterate, as an individual, I may choose to forgive. and that's between me and God. But it is justice that our beloved guardian comes back to again and again when referring to the establishment of the most great peace. And so this is what he says. Small wonder, therefore, that the author of the Baha'i Revelation should have chosen to associate the name and title of that house, which is to be the crowning glory of his administrative institutions, not with forgiveness, but with justice. To have made justice the only basis and the permanent foundation of his most great peace, and to have proclaimed it in his hidden words as the best beloved of all things in his sight. To have made justice the only basis and the permanent foundation of his most great peace. And so I ask you, as you think about intent versus impact, which is really a big debate in the race field, to think about these quotes and to meditate on them, and to think about the impact, right? And this idea of justice, and how do we redress inequities to achieve justice. And Shoghi Effendi tells us, let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct their tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude towards the members of their race. And so I shared this quote. We're all familiar with this quote. But when we read this quote with the backdrop of the synthesis of, discourses of society, here specifically it was critical whiteness studies, we can better understand what Shoghi Effendi means when he says usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, right? We can better understand where that comes from historically, what we have inherited as a nation. What does this patronizing attitude mean? Where does that come from? And so thinking about the literature and the research, right, to deeply start meditating on Shoghi Effendi's words and reflecting on what they mean. O son of being, bring thyself to account each day, ere thou art summoned to a reckoning. For death and herald shall come upon thee, and thou should be called to give account of thy deeds. And so once again here, I want to focus on deeds. When we think about the ways whiteness and white supremacy function, how can we as Baha'is begin to break the expected racial contract, right, through our deeds? How can we in our own lives be race traders and not act white? What would that look like on a day-to-day basis? And he says they should each endeavor day and night to fulfill their particular responsibilities in the common task which so urgently faces them. And so there's also this sense of urgency, right? We can see it in the world around us as the old world order is breaking down. There's this sense of urgency. And so how do we take responsibility and take these words to heart? And so I just want to end with this question. So after you've heard the presentation, can you now think of a situation in your own life where ignorance was knowledge? All right. I am done with my presentation.
Well, from the time I was very young, I was taught the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And then, as I grew older, I didn't know of prejudice, and I was never taught anything like that, and I think that you're preaching to the choir. If there's prejudice within the Baha'i community or any at all, then I don't want to be here, because this is not why I believe everybody is the same. We have our differences in our lives, etc. I went to New York college, a community college, and then a regular college, and I sat with black students. I sat with black students, and I integrated myself. Many times I wasn't spoken to at all, which was understandable, but I was comfortable. And then I went to North Carolina Central University and had prejudice on me because I'm white. I am a white woman, and I have had privilege, and I understand that privilege. And I integrate myself into, if there's a seat with a group of black students, I sit there because I belong. I belong with everyone. I love everyone. I can't understand people who don't. And that's why I joined the Baha'i religion, because I understand everyone is human. And yes, it's what we do, not what we say or repeat, all of the prejudicial rhetoric that goes on. Not repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
Not repeat it in our lives, but not repeat it over a space of time, which I'm listening yesterday and day before that. It's good for people who don't believe, but I hope that you're preaching to the choir.
You know, thank you for sharing that comment. I think we all, as the Guardian says, we all have our work cut out for us to do, and I think it's up to each individual to really reflect and pray and deepen on where they're at in the process. And so my role here, and I appreciate you sharing, my role here is really to synthesize the research so that we can better deeply understand, one, the wider, broader discourses of society, which is research, right? So research is showing us that white ignorance and this idea of acting white still exists in our communities, and then how do we go about that? So thank you. So are there any other comments or questions?
I want to know how we go about that.
Okay, all right.
Bye.
I will definitely, let's chat about that actually. How do we go about that? Thank you so much. Any comments or, responses to how do we go about that? Kathy, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much for this excellent synthesis of the research, because I like your statement at the beginning, which is, I'm not here to prove this because it's already been documented, but I want to explain it. And I think the explanation really helps unpack or break down how the ideology of white supremacy is perpetuated. And part of it is perpetuated by white people not learning the history of how this has evolved over time, and the many ways that white supremacy has been woven into every institution in our country, which is why it is the most vital and challenging issue, because it's tough. It's tough to disentangle white supremacy from any aspect of life. It's almost just a given. And when you come to this country, whether you're aware of it or not, you can be infected with this, the Guardian and the House calls it a spiritual disease, a spiritual disorder. And so I thought it was very helpful to see how just kind of nodding your head when people make statements that are kind of code for I'm not racist, but, and then it's followed by some kind of comment that indicates othering those people who don't understand our ways. That's just another way of saying that people of color are not equal to the way, quote, we are. And I think I grew up in a family that said things like that. The next generation was a little bit better, and then the next generation was a little bit less prejudicial and blatant in comments. However, it was there. And so as a child, I grew up with grandparents who passed along these concepts. And so for me, now as a Baha'i, I take it as a spiritual obligation to look back and assess, what did I pick up along the way? What have I assumed was the norm? And which ones of those comments and assumptions do I need to really examine and try to eliminate it? As the Guardian says, pay attention to your own needs, your own concepts, your own attitudes, and your own conduct. So I think these primarily reading groups that I've been joining have a lot of white people in them who are really trying to learn about how we have been affected by this disease. And then we can learn how to root it out. And so for me, it's an ongoing life journey. It's an assignment from Baha'u'llah, it's an assignment from Abdu'l-Baha, it's an assignment from the Guardian, it's assignment from the Universal House of Justice. This is a lifelong journey of spiritual development, and part of spiritual development is the elimination of any concept where I might regard myself as better than any other human being.
Thank you. Hada, how do you say your name? Sorry, Hoda or Hada? I can't hear you.
So my name is Hoda.
Hoda. Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you. I'm so glad that Chuck invited me to attend. I wanted to ask, I really appreciate your very comprehensive presentation, and I can't help but wish and pray that you actually spoke Farsi, because I would love this presentation to be shared with the Iranian believers who remain very aloof about the subject, and we're also very ignorant of the fact that we are conditionally bombarded, as if we didn't have issues to begin with classism, colorism, sexism, all the other isms that are very prevalent in the Iranian society, but come over here and with the fallacious doctrine of white supremacy, where actually it becomes a powder keg of a very, very difficult to the invisibleness of the structural racism in terms of how we benefit from it, but also how we do it at a cost to the people of African descent and the brown people and the black people in America. So my specific question is, if you could please kindly, if you could expand at another event on how immigrant racism and this ever expanding whiteness and how, because the Italians weren't white, Irish weren't white, and for sure, Iranians aren't white. I'm grappling with and I think a lot of Iranian Baha'is are grappling, am I white? Because look at me. I mean, I can pass for a white American. Am I white? Am I white passing? Because of my mom says, Hoda, you're white. I'm white. And I said, no, stand up in a room full of white people and shout you're white. If they know you're Iranian, you ain't white. So I just really need more clarification on another event, really. And I would also, so if you could explain, that aspect of how Iranians can refer, and I don't like the word Persian, because it's a kind of cop-out, because people don't know Iranian. Persians are Iranian, so it's kind of, we use it as an instrument to kind of not identify with the Islamic Republic of Iran and the shouting the death to America chanting that people associate us with.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also this the specific slide, I'm so sorry that I'm so excited. This specific on how whiteness or white race ideology is perpetuated. In the 4 categories, you said we are equal, I don't see color, the storylines, I come from a family of immigrants, you know, I made it, you've been here for 400 years, why aren't you making it? And the semantic move, I'm not racist, but I see that all the time, I hear it, and I speak up to it, and obviously there's a lot of pushback and criticism. So just, I really need to expand, for you to expand in that area. I don't want to take up the space today, but please do it later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your comments. And, you know, the aspect of ethnic identity versus cultural identity versus racial identity is very interesting. And it took me a really long time to understand, you know, having been born and raised and immersed in an all-Black community, I definitely culturally feel Gabonese, right? But I can't say I'm Gabonese necessarily because I don't have Black skin, right? And so being able, it took me a long time to even from a academic and literature perspective to really dissect these terms. And one of the important pieces of that is racial literacy, which is really understanding the term race. What is the term race, white and Black and people of color, or all of these different races, that the terms that we're using, to deeply understand them as a social construct. So, you know, when we think about Persians, I think one of the struggles is that, you know, there's this term white passing, right? And so someone can identify as a person of color, but they're white passing, meaning that they're accruing benefits from the society because they are visibly, they pass as white. And so another misconception that happens often is that we think that everyone who passes as white, or who is visible as white, or is acknowledged as a white person, all receive an equal amount of benefits, but we know from the system, but we know that's not true, right? So white males, specifically white males, receive a very specific type of benefit that maybe poor white males versus rich white males would not receive the same type of benefits. Or even a white woman or a Persian woman who's passing would receive some benefits, but not necessarily the same amount as a white male, rich white male would receive benefits. I don't know if that makes sense. And so right there's already a spectrum, right? And then there's this misconception of the American dream and, you know, of immigrants coming to this country. And this happens, you know, with my experiences with Black African immigrants, they have a similar problem where they've come from war-torn refugee countries and they believe in the American dream, and the United States let them in and gave them support and welfare support and opportunities for work and to start a new life that they would have never had in another country, right? In the country that they fled. And so they're coming to this country wanting to assimilate into whiteness, right? But they don't realize that that's what we're doing. And so similarly, other immigrants, such as maybe Persians and other ones, even the Irish and the Italians, all of us came to this country to assimilate into whiteness, but we didn't really know what that meant and the consequences of that, right? We didn't understand that assimilating into whiteness was essentially giving up our identity as white people, as an Irish and German. That's my ethnic identity. I know nothing about my ethnic identity. It was never passed down through generations because we bought into whiteness, into a very specific form of ideology, and gave up our actual cultural and ethnic identities, right? And I like to think about it as dehumanizing, right? We gave up slowly pieces of ourselves and our soul to buy into this material wealth and resources which everyone comes to this country for. And so this, even just this process of accumulation and coming to this country, and so you know, even Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who does a lot of work on race and colorblind ideology, talks about the Latinx communities and even the colorism in their communities, and how even them, right, they want to come to this country and they want to assimilate and pass as white, because everybody knows that if you pass as white, the kind of resources and the benefits that you're going to be given are different, right? So the more you distance yourself from people of color and try to assimilate into white spaces, white culture, whiteness, the more opportunity, the more resources, the more benefits you receive. And this is a process of brainwashing that happens historically. And so it's a very interesting process. So I would love to dig into that sometime. That's a great suggestion. I don't know if that helps a little bit, and we can talk. Yeah, Chuck will give you my information and we can talk more offline. I see that there was Gregory, but someone else had their hand up, and I don't remember who else had their hand up. Gregory, do you want to go next?
Yes, sorry, I had to come and sit back down. Two things, sorry. There is this phenomenon of people of color passing as white. It's not new, it's been around for centuries. First of all, I want to really thank you for the work that you're doing on whiteness. When I first saw it during ABS, I thought, why do white people leave? You know, now I just really get it. I think it's work that really needs to be done, because people of color have to do this work, whether they speak about it, whether they know it or not. We are always, in my opinion, digging into trying to figure out, understand, what is it? I think it's time white people do that. And I really, really deeply appreciate that study. I mean, it's a study, it's academic, it's looked at. So thank you, Liz, for really, really engaging in that work. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to do a little quote from the Race Unity Statement, because one of the first questions was, what do we do, right? No real change can come about without close association, friendship, and fellowship among people of diverse backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you. So can we, Gregory, sorry to put you on the spot, but I would love to maybe dig into that a little bit more. And I would like to hear from people. Can we talk about that? What does that look like? So what are some experiences? What does that look like in real life? Can we really dig into that? Yes.
Yeah. For me, when I spent at least a decade being kind of discouraged with Christianity because it wasn't really dealing with this issue. And I ran into some Baha'is in the 90s who were talking about race unity, equality of women and men. There was a group called the Institute for the Healing of Racism. There were race unity dialogues where I was trained shoulder to shoulder with white people, right? And as a Black man, I have white friends, but it's similar to Black people having Black friends. But I did that in the presence of people who, once they started to see the race issues, really felt to the point where they just really would like to just come out of their skin when they see things exemplified by other white people. As a Black person, I saw that, and that taught me how to trust and understand and bring down the barriers. So that the development of those relationships have been what kept me, literally, aside from the power of Baha'u'llah, connected to the faith, right? And those friendships have really, really encouraged me throughout the years when I am in the presence of a room full of Baha'is who are poo-pooing my concerns, right? Or who choose not to see me, right? Because I am an invisible man in a lot of places. It's disturbing when I'm amongst Baha'is. So I appreciate the fact that those relationships, that I have those relationships in my life. And I'm not gonna like name people, but it has changed my life. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Would anyone else like to add to this specific conversation about forging and really sustaining friendships?
I'll just say something really quick off the top of my head. I think that, please, that'd be great. I think that the need for forging friendships with people of diverse backgrounds is because in our segregation, we kind of create this imagination in our head about what's happening, and then we create stories around it that aren't true. And it's just very baffling to me. I mean, because white people are so segregated, we just really honestly live in this kind of bubble of imagination of what's happening to people of color and Black people and indigenous people. And so unless we are engaged in these deep friendships where we can actually get to a point of trust and love, where we can talk with our friends about their lived experience, or they're even willing to share because they trust us enough and love us enough, then we're going to continue to live in that imagination and deny that racism is actually happening. I guess I'll just leave it at that for now.
And something to piggyback on that, Michelle, and Chuck, I'll get to you right after that, is that we often tend to want to ask Black people what we should do, or people of color, or forge friendships so that we can learn from them. And I would like to say this right now, that's not authentic. You know, if you're forging a friendship because you want to understand what you're doing wrong, then I would recommend that you start reading. There are a lot of authors of color that will give you the information, or you're reaching out to other sources. But I think that asking people of color who you think are your friends to do the emotional labor for you is not a sign of friendship. And I want to share that because it happens all the time, and we call them best friends or friends because we want to do that, right? And if you were to really ask them whether they considered you a friend or a best friend, maybe that answer wouldn't be reciprocal, because once again, you're coming from a state of white normativity where you're the dominant, right? And you're coming from this dominant perspective of what you think friendships, or even this dialogue, is it dialogical or reciprocal? I can't remember, kind of relationship is. And so it's tricky. How do you forge these really deep, sustaining friendships and build trust in a way that is empowering to the people of the eye, as Jackie mentioned in the chat. Chuck, did you want to add something?
If I could just add to that, I appreciate that you're saying that, because it's usually something that I add to that conversation. Especially, I mean, and I've heard it from, Black people, indigenous people, people of color, like, we need to do this, but we also need to have that in mind. And it's not an ulterior motive for us to become friends with people because we want them to teach us. That has to be understood. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. Yes, Chuck.
Well, I just wanted to start by thanking you, Liz, for this wonderful presentation that I've now heard several times, and it's better every time I hear it. And I learn so much. I wanted to paraphrase Baha'u'llah when he says that the greatest loss is for one to live their life without knowing themselves. And in this process of building relationship, it's so important to me. It has that the motivation for doing that is to be firm in the covenant, to obey Baha'u'llah. And as you were talking about the racial contract, I was thinking, we as Baha'is have another contract, and that's the covenant. That's the contract that we should be going by, And so the other piece of these relationships for me has been regaining my humanity. You talked a little bit earlier about the loss that whiteness kind of brings about, a loss of humanity, a loss of connection with our ethnicity, of who we really are. And I can say that my relationships with Black friends has helped me restore that. It's kind of hard to describe how that goes about, but I think it's part of being close to the lived experience of people of color that has helped me in that way. And it's not something I ask for, my friendships have been so generous. My friends have been so generous to me, but I can't do this for any. I can't ask for anything back. I think the reasons for us to do this work as whites is really to be firm in the covenant, to obey Baha'u'llah, to live lives of authenticity and justice, but not to be expecting to get positive feedback, because if we live for that, we never go anywhere. So that's I think the most important point to me is that this has helped me restore my sense of authenticity as a human being, kind of moving away from that white ideology that has kind of encircled me as a white person with a white body, and has given me a new sense of identity as a human being.
Excellent.
Thank you.
What's your name again?
Gregory, my name is Chuck.
Hey, Liz.
Yes.
This is Catherine.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. I can say one thing that listening to these talks has made me more aware and observe more with white privilege. I'm saying that because I was at the bank this week, and the officer asked for ID, and I said, okay, that's good, but it was a business transaction, so it had to have another person sign who was white. So, and it was a couple of us, and we were just talking. So he came to the bank, and earlier he said, well, I'm gonna have to have his ID too. And we said, okay, that's good. So when he came in, we were talking, and he had papers to sign. He didn't ask him for the ID. And we sit there and said, okay, what happened here? He didn't ask for the ID. And so when we went out, we were discussing that, okay, he asked for your ID, but he didn't ask for that ID. And it's making me more aware of this white privilege. And the other person who signed, he knew white privilege, but it made me aware that you have to, when I walked out, I said, man, we have to speak up, because that loan officer doesn't know what he just did. It's something in my mind. I was thinking, okay, it's something that they do and not aware of it. So that made me more aware, okay, I've got to speak out so they will understand what they're doing. Is allowing certain things to happen and to know what it is, make them conscious of it. And that will help only him, but any other white person that they wait on, to always ask for ID and not giving them that privilege, that white privilege of not asking. So this is the one thing one of the things that I have learned so much from these talks, made me more aware of what's going on.
So
thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really great. And then, yes, Uncle Kaiser.
Yes, I just like to say, Liz, am I on?
Yes.
I'd just like to say how excellent the presentation was and is for all of us. I mean, excellent. And the contributions that everyone has made is so helpful to my own learning and my own effort that all of us are having. And I'm particularly pleased the references to the advent of divine justice. And I think that all of us are appreciating in these conversations the genius of Shoghi Effendi and the enormous contribution that he has made, bringing forward, as only he can do, the revelation of Baha'u'llah and the interpretations of Abdu'l-Baha. All of us will be able to find that Baha'u'llah speaks about prerequisites, and Abdu'l-Baha speaks about prerequisites, and no one is surprised that everything Shoghi Effendi says is grounded in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. It makes us so very happy and proud that our religion comes forward in the world. The words of Baha'u'llah, close your eyes to racial differences and everything. In other words, we're learning. And that's one of the things, Liz, I can tell you what ignorance that I had, that I learned, and that great ignorance that I had was the ignorance of religion and the ignorance of the whole purpose of religion, and of course the ignorance of the revelation. Finally, I'd like to say one word about friendship. What an interesting concept it is. And once again, when we have any of these questions, we have the smorgasbord of the holy writings we can go to and see what Baha'u'llah has said. I was in one conference and one person was insisting no prejudice and so forth. And I could tell the teenage child was a little bit irritating, sitting beside father. And finally, the young boy couldn't contain it anymore. He says, yes, we are president. This is a Baha'i meeting now. He says, I know we are because I never saw you, father and mother, to have any Black person in our home. Mm. Never, he says, you know, and it was a little embarrassment. The point I like to just end with is this friendship, we can start with one at a time, making friends and sometime getting over the fact that the minority person may be a little shy. And sometimes just to reach out and to reach out in new ways, revolutionary ways. All of us never can forget, Shoghi Effendi says that there must be a revolutionary change in attitude of the white believer, a revolutionary change in attitude. So this friendship business starting with having people in the home, the sincerity of it, the spirituality of it, to be acquainted with the children and opening the home. And I think this is what Shoghi Effendi meant when he says the relationships, not just at the 19-day feast, not just at the conferences, but a relationship in a deeper personal way. So all these aspects of friendship, having prayer, but to do things differently, and as everyone is suggesting, to have honest considerations of it, and honest and truthful thoughts, what might have given the impression that I'm satisfied just with the casual association at the 19-day feast. The casual association is something that each of us have to work on. And just one last reference, I was like you, Liz, and your parents in Africa, and I was understanding the promotion of the faith among the people in the village. What did it mean? It meant, in my understanding, I had to go to those villages and I had to sleep overnight with them on the floor. And I had to eat and I had to show that our faith was a faith of friendship, making me act differently and making me come to their level and to go into their homes and to not feel it was anything, you see, just to have that association in a spiritual way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Are there any other, what else? What else? Any questions? Any comments? Any burning thoughts? Maybe we can take one more comment. I know it's a little late. Sue?
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I was a little shy to do it.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so incredibly moved and grateful to you for synthesizing your life experience into this work. I think you were born and raised for it, and I'm praising Baha'u'llah and God for bringing you into this world and giving you the intelligence and the emotions and the spiritual greatness to provide what we need right now. This disease has come to the surface so powerfully that the remedy is urgent. And I'm thinking of the House of Justice letter, the paragraph 5, where it says, ultimately the power to transform the world is effected by love, a love that's originating from the relationship with the divine, love ablaze among members of a community, love extended without restriction to every human being. This is that remedy. It's like to COVID-19, that remedy is love. And it's not what we do. It's what we need to be. The House of Justice is calling on us. Shoghi Effendi, Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah have called upon us. Jesus called upon us to love. A friend says, justice is the operation of divine law, and the divine law is love. So if the remedy to this heart disease of racism is love, and your presentation today has brought this whole emotion out of me to reflect back on you, and it's helped to crystallize my own conversation with people and my own urgency, especially Amy Cooper. When you showed that clip of Amy Cooper, when she said to, what was his first name?
Chris.
Pardon? Chris, that's right. When she said to Chris, "You're threatening me." And when she called the police and said, "A black man is threatening me," my immediate response is, no, you feel threatened. If I look objectively at his tone of voice, his manner, his behavior, he did nothing to threaten her, except perhaps the perception of being filmed for what purpose. But it was her fear and her sense of threat to her life, that, or her well-being or her privilege or whatever, that caused her to go into a fight or flight response and call on police for backup. And if we could all just own the responsibility for our feelings. I feel threatened, and if I have the love of God, what can threaten me? What can threaten me? So they're back to the brilliance of the House of Justice, to call on this love into action, which is like activate that love within ourselves to own. I feel threatened. I feel afraid. I feel angry. I feel sad. And he can't make me feel that way. I do. I'm just reflecting that back, and wonder if you have any comments in reply. And also, by the way, do you offer continuing, perhaps Zooms like this, where we could continue this with you?
That's something I'll think about. I would love to. I think I just want to, I think one of my main motivations is, and I'm learning this with everyone else, and I would love to have your suggestions, is how do we accompany each other within the framework of the 5-year plan? I think it's important to figure out how are we engaging in discourses, and how are we continuing the conversations in different spaces. But I always struggle, you know, how do we frame it within the framework of the 5-year plan and ensure that we're still working towards all 3 aspects: social action, community building, and discourses. And so to veer off into creating a program, I kind of hesitate to do that, because I think, I don't know if it's, we can talk more about it. I would to bring.
So how about it's been running around in my mind of creating an online devotional study group on racism specifically.
I love it.
This would actually contribute to a devotional gathering and a study circle specifically on racism. And I don't think we actually have a study circle yet that literally addresses the most vital and challenging issue like this. I know that some people are using book 1 to focus on racism, but if you'd be interested in even writing a study circle, that, or creating a study circle with us as a focus group for your new devotional study circle online, and we could create it together as well.
I love this idea. Can we brainstorm off this session?
Yes, if you can be in touch with me. I gave you my email address in your chat.
Okay,
thanks.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I'm very excited about all those ideas.
Thank you.
I know, let's do one last comment for Hoda. And sorry, just before I give you the last comment, I just wanted to respond to, you know, the Universal House of Justice letter that I think it was the Universal House of Justice that you read, you know, about love and divine love. I really have studied it on multiple occasions. And one of the things that I often think about, and some friends know this, is the difference between conditional and unconditional love, right? Because oftentimes we don't connect this idea of conditional love with whiteness. But when we think about how historically whites have been able to control white people, the white collective, and also perpetuate fear and control onto Black and brown bodies, it's through this idea of conditional love, right? This idea of the racial contract. Like, for example, and that's also been passed down through Christian backgrounds. Like, you know, my parents, you know, did it. My grandparents would raise me with this conditional love. Like, if you're not a good example, or if you're not, you know, if you don't do things as I say, you're going to do them, then I'm going to, they may not say I'm going to withhold love from you, but that was kind of the threat, right? If you're not a good person in a very specific way that I expect you to be, then I'm either going to marginalize you or withhold love from you until you behave the way and conform to the way that I want you to conform. And I think that culturally, sometimes we find this kind of conditional love in Baha'i communities, but that's not what the writings say when we read the writings, right? The writings really emphasize the love that we're supposed to show and share with everyone, regardless of regardless of our actions, right? And so I think of unconditional love as divine love, right? How do we as a parent, how do I as a mother give Eva, my daughter, unconditional love, and also inspire her to love the covenant and love Baha'u'llah, rather than try to follow the Baha'i faith as in fear. Now, that's not to say, and I think this idea of forgiveness and justice we can still love and implement justice and what is right. We can still love and implement, the Guardian talks about reward and punishment. I can still love her and implement punishment, not out of spite or out of hate, but out of love, in a very loving way. And so to think about this idea of conditional and unconditional love, how it's been perpetuated historically, to shun people, to force people into this white collective, and the fear of being kicked out or marginalized it's very powerful. And so I'm glad you brought that up, and maybe that's something we can explore in another session as well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Hada. I
I'm
said
so
that wrong.
sorry. I'm asking this question. I'm so thirsty for your knowledge. In one of the slides you had is, how is whiteness or white racial ideology perpetuated? And the second thing you talked about is white emotions. And then you said, we employ white emotions rather than deal with shame. We project it to others. As a white woman, I'm entitled to break a lot of rules. And I thought about it as I'm driving. I never have to worry. I've never had to worry about how I need to behave when I'm stopped by a police officer, because I know there's two Americas, one white, one black, separate, unequal, and totally hostile. And I realized that because I've never had to give my children the talk, they're grown kids right now, about how to behave when they're stopped at a traffic light, etc. So I kind of use that example, how I'm entitled to break a lot of rules. And then you said, we suppress the shame and guilt, but project something on others. Can you build on that? Because that's something, if we could get good at explaining and understanding it individually, taking account for ourselves, then how we suppress the shame and guilt, because it stops the growth.
Right.
But project what onto others?
Okay.
Please break that down.
Sure. So first, I just want to recommend this book. It's called, I'm pretty sure it's called Learning to Be White. It's by Tendeka. She did research on white identity or whiteness, and she essentially interviewed a lot of white people on their very first experiences of when they remember the first time that they identified as a white person or they noticed that they were white. And all of those experiences revolved around shame and guilt, which also gets us to conditional love, right? So, maybe it was when they were really young, they brought a black friend over to play, and they could tell by the reaction of their family and their parents. Maybe it wasn't explicit, like, how dare you bring a black friend over, but the way that the black friend was treated, or the way the white friend, the child was treated afterwards, right? In a way that they were shamed and guilt and said, how dare you do this? Don't ever bring this person over, or this is not how we do things. So or even, driving down the street in a black neighborhood and your parents locking the car doors. Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful statement, okay? Mm-hmm. It's a very powerful statement. And it may be in that moment, the white child notices that everybody around in the neighborhood is black, and then that he's or she is white. So there are all of these experiences, and a lot of them, the first memory is being shamed or guilted, right? But especially this deep shame, shamed into a behavior, shamed for a behavior that involved race. Okay. And so from a very young age, this is how we're taught to conform. We're taught to be bred into this ideology of hate through shame. And so, oftentimes people are saying, why do you focus on white people, or not even white people, but on whiteness? Because a lot of people of color have told me they learn a lot from these presentations as well, in terms of understanding the ideology. And I think Catherine was referring to that earlier as well. And they say, why don't you focus on racism? Why don't you focus on the symptom? And my comment to them, why are you bothering with white people? They just need to shut up and listen, right? They just need to stay in their corner, shut up and listen, We'll tell them what to do. They've done enough damage. But the reality is that if you suppress and shun people, they're never actually, and shame them for their emotions, these really strong emotions that they experience, they're never actually going to work through them. And so what happens when we experience shame, so let's say, you know, I'm experiencing shame over the way I treated someone, or let's say in the Amy Cooper video, she was experiencing shame because she knew she did something wrong. She had her dog off leash. She could have reacted differently and told Chris, yes, I'm sorry. I agree. I broke the rule. Own it. Take responsibility. I'm experiencing shame. She may not say that, right? But she realizes that she's experiencing shame, and she needs to work through why she thinks it's okay for her to have her dog off leash, right? Work through the entitlement or the white emotions. Now, that doesn't help white supremacy or whiteness, right? When you work through those emotions and you understand how the system is making you, we're being taught to suppress it, right? We're being taught to suppress the shame very strategically so that we can perpetuate these emotions. And, you know, Robin DiAngelo gets at this in a very superficial way, but I think one of the criticisms that I have about her work is that she doesn't dig deep into the shame piece. She doesn't dig deep. She essentially makes people feel bad about their emotions, but doesn't help them understand the shame aspect of it. And so if I feel shame, and we do this not just with race, but in any relationship that we have, right? If we're embarrassed or shamed or guilted, what do? We lash out onto the other person if we don't know what we're doing. If we're not self-aware, I'm gonna get really angry, right? And I'm actually really angry with myself, but instead of dealing with my own shame, I'm going to be like, the blaming, right? You did this to me and it's your fault that I'm, you know, I don't know, it's your fault and I'm angry and I have rage, or I'm really sad because you told me this, right? So rather, even if it's honest, rather than dealing with the shame that I'm experiencing and having to work through it, I suppress it and then I blame somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. And so this idea of self-awareness, we have to work on self-awareness.
So we project blame.
We project blame, and it's manifested in different ways. And there's a lot of research around this that talks about the cycle. So there's different dimensions of whiteness. This aspect of whiteness, this white ideology, is called the psychoanalytic piece of whiteness, where so like the mental health piece of whiteness, right? That is very powerful, and if we suppress it, we're perpetuating white supremacy in the ways that we're doing that. And so that's why I say that's one way white supremacy is perpetuated, and that's why these white emotions can be weaponized in ways to control and inflict violence and fear onto Black and brown bodies. Yeah. So friends, it's 1 p.m. and I think we need to wrap up. I'm really loving these discussions, and I hope I'm excited for all the suggestions and ideas, and I look forward to connecting with everyone. Are there, I don't know if we can either close out with a song, or anyone wants to either sing or share some kind of prayer. Any volunteers?
No. This is a prayer for justice. I beseech thee, O my God, by all the transcendent glory of thy name, to clothe thy loved ones in the robe of justice, and to illumine their beings with the light of trustworthiness. Thou art the one that hath power to do as he pleaseth. and who holdeth within his grasp the reins of all things, visible and invisible.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Liz. This was wonderful.
Yes, thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Liz.
Take care. Have a good day, everyone. Enjoy the nice weather.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Liz. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.